Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover some guides on how to improve our pacing for the ACT reading comprehension section, how to get down your time per passage and actually finish this section on time. If you haven't already seen my videos on the intro to reading comprehension section, so you know what you're getting into, what our overall strategy is going to be, and then my strategy video going into how to actually approach every passage, I recommend you go watch those first so you know what I'm talking about here and what I'm going to be tweaking in those strategies. If you do find this helpful, you can help me out by leaving a like and subscribing. So let's get into this. But again, keep in mind, this is a challenging process, one of the hardest parts of the ACT, so have some patience and know it's going to take some practice. You won't get there overnight, and everybody's going to be different, so we might have to tweak different things and try out a few different strategies until you find what works for you. I'm going to give you an idea of some things to try. You don't need to do all of them. You might find something else that works for you, but hopefully we can figure this out with some practice. So, starting out, you're going to want to do one passage at a time. And again, this first slide's a reminder. This was actually in one of the earlier videos, but it's important, and this is the first thing you need to start thinking about to actually tackling your pacing. So don't go and do the entire reading comprehension section for one practice test right off the bat. Instead, do every passage and time it individually. So that way you can try and learn how to consistently get close to your target, 8.5 to 9 minutes per passage. If you start out by doing the entire thing and trying to finish in your 35 minutes, most everyone is not going to be able to finish in 35 minutes. So instead, you're going to fall behind in those first few, and you're going to start practicing going really fast and missing everything and doing things poorly on the last few to finish on time. You don't want to practice that because you're just wasting valuable practice passages and you're just practicing bad habits. Instead, break them up, do one passage at a time, knowing that each one's a little too long and you wouldn't actually finish on time if you did that, but you can slowly start bringing each one in until you're actually able to consistently get close to this target. Once you are close to that, then you can start doing the entire passage as a whole, aiming for your limit of 35 minutes. At that point, you can start trying to figure out, okay, now do I know if I'm falling behind a little bit? Maybe I can implement a few of these little strategies I'm about to go into to speed up the last few. Or maybe you might realize I'm ahead a little bit, so I can slow down and maybe look for these detail questions a little bit more. As a final step, once you have that down, print out the ACT bubble sheet if you're planning to take this on the paper test, because the actual act of bubbling in your answer takes some time. It might not be much, but for several of my students, once we finally got down to finishing on time, once I had them actually start bubbling in their answers instead of just circling it on the paper, they were no longer finishing on time. They might have had to miss out on one or two more questions. So you're going to want to practice that. If you're trying to take it online, then obviously you're just going to select your answer there, and that'll be a little different. So if you are doing it online, go to the TestNav's website and get used to that software and dealing with their highlighting tools and how to annotate with that. So that way you're not even slower by just having to deal with a new program that you've never dealt with before. So now for each passage individually, we already talked about breaking down the whole section into individual passages. You're going to find a big theme here is just breaking it down into small parts and timing each part individually and working on each section by itself. So within each passage, we're going to time the reading part by itself and then the questions by themselves. So our goal is 3 to 4 minutes to read the passage, and then that would leave 5 to 6 minutes, depending on how much time you are able to spend reading your passage. Hopefully you're on the shorter end, so you'll have more time here, but everybody's different. These are just some rough guidelines. I did have some of my students that are just slower readers, but they're really quick at finding the answers, so they can get away with maybe 5 minutes reading, and then they only have 4 minutes to find their answers, but that's a lot harder for most people. But try things out, figure out what works for you. So stop after the reading. Once you have your time, write down your reading time, then you can restart your timer and time it for the questions. That's going to let you figure out which of those two parts is actually slowing you down and it's your biggest pacing problem. Or if you're like a lot of people when they first come in, it's both. And you have to work on both of them. And you can try different strategies and see, okay, well, this strategy is helping with the questions, but I'm not really improving on the read. Let's try a new strategy there and see if I can get that reading time down. And you can tackle them both at the same time. Or if you're already good on one, then like let's say you're reading in 3.5 minutes every time, but you're still not finishing on time. By doing this, you're going to know it's the questions that are the problem. So you're not going to have to try all sorts of new strategies to maybe read a little faster. Although if you can, great, but you're probably better off trying to find ways to speed up the questions. So work on your timing for each of those parts separately. You don't want to practice rushing those questions. Just like I was saying, you don't want to do the entire 4 passages at once before you're any good, because then you're going to go too slow at first, and then practice speeding up and going crazy fast on the last few passages. The same thing can happen if you try and do an entire passage and your reading time is too slow. Then you're going to practice trying to answer questions in 2 minutes. And that's just not something you can do, and you need to figure out how to work on your reading speed. Instead, work on the reading speed on its own, and then try to get your questions down to a reasonable time. And you can kind of hit both parts individually. If you realize you start hitting a wall on one, then you might have to try and squeeze a little bit of time out from the other. So the next few slides are going to go into strategies for each of these parts. How can I improve the reading speed? How can I improve the questions? I would recommend that before you go and start tweaking any of your strategies that we had talked about in our strategy section, you do at least one full reading comprehension test or two, because that way any kind of natural improvement that's going to come from being more comfortable with knowing what to expect with these tests, you can already kind of be a little bit more comfortable already, and you'll know, okay, now I actually do have to implement these strategies. And especially the annotating part. That's something where a lot of people aren't used to it, so it takes a while for them to adjust. Honestly, just one test or two probably won't have you perfectly comfortable in annotations, but you'll at least be closer, and you might have an idea of what you can work on. So for the reading, how can I reduce my reading time? I know I've said it before, but it's very important. Don't reread any paragraphs or lines. It's very tempting. I know I personally tend to be a little bit of a slower reader, and I'll often maybe jump ahead a little bit accidentally and then tempted to go back and reread what I accidentally just skipped because my brain bounces around. I can't do that with the ACT. I'm going to run out of time. So if that happens, I just need to keep moving and focus in on what's ahead. If I get to a question then on something that doesn't sound familiar, it's probably in that part that I skipped or that I wasn't paying enough attention to, then I can go reread it. So this is what I was just saying. If you do get zoned out or lost in a paragraph, one strategy you can use is you can reread the first and the last sentence of that paragraph. That won't give you everything, but normally that gives you a rough idea of what's discussed in the paragraph, the introduction and the conclusion of it. Not always, but it might give you a good idea. So then you'll know, hey, a question seems like it might be something that they were about to get into for that paragraph. Then try reading several in a row, timing each one, and just say, all right, I was too slow. I'm going to try and read a little bit faster, getting a little bit less and less comfortable with my reading speed each time. Now, it's one thing to just say it, another to do it, but you need to actively say, okay, that wasn't fast enough. I need to read a little bit faster. And you might not like it. You might start reaching the point where you don't fully grasp what's going on in each one. You need to find where that line is to what's fast enough to finish on time, but you still have some idea what's happening. Remember, you don't need to then be able to answer all these questions from memory. You just have to be able to know where to find the answers. So that way you can dial in exactly how fast do you have to read. For a lot of people, that's not going to be a speed where they're entirely comfortable. But you don't want to go so fast that it's a skim and you're totally lost. You can try setting an alarm while you're reading for that 4-minute goal. That way when it goes off, you can know, okay, this is where I'm at. I am 3/4 of the way through. So I should be done by now. So I need to speed up and go that much faster. Or you might realize, okay, I'm actually kind of close. Here's where I'm at. and it might help you figure out exactly how far off are you. It's very similar to this, but for some students, this gives them a better idea of what they're targeting. And you'll get an idea of just the feel of what is 4 minutes. Because every time you hit go and start reading, it's going to be 4 minutes when that goes off. So you'll get a better idea of what does that feel like. The last thing would be adjusting your annotations. I put that at the end here for a reason. If I put it at the top, it's the first thing my students will always try and do is like, oh, well, clearly I can't annotate. I'm too slow. I didn't want to do them anyways. Here's my proof. Don't do that. Annotations take a while to get used to. They're very helpful. Yes, we will adjust them for every student individually, but we try other things first. So don't jump straight to this. Try other things, and then at the very end, you can try tweaking this to what works best for you. So some things you can try. First of all, never write in the margins. Only underline or bracket, or if you're online, highlight. Writing actual words just takes longer and it's not necessary. You're just going to waste a little bit more time. If you have to, you can write maybe a word. Switch to more use of brackets and parentheses instead of underlining, especially if it's long sentences that you're trying to underline. If you just go and say, let's say like from here to here to here was one long sentence that I thought was important, instead of going underline, 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 that took a while. I could just go and make a bracket go like that. Here, I'll even get the marker. Show you what I'm talking about. Instead of doing this to this to this, that took a bit. I could just go like that, much faster. So try that out, and that might help speed up a good bit. Another thing you can do is annotate less. Be very careful with that, but you can do it. I would suggest cutting out that first time a noun is introduced, a proper noun that is. You should always try and keep the emotional language, the attention-grabbing punctuation, and the time jumps. If this doesn't sound familiar to you, you probably didn't watch my strategy video yet. Go watch that, and that'll go into why we care about each of these 4 things, but these are the 4 things we're trying to annotate. But since this has a lot of stuff, that's the one we can only cut out. There's normally not a lot of these other 3, so it doesn't help much to cut them out. And if they do exist, you really want to make sure you notice them, because there's almost always going to be a question about them if they do show up. Now, for the questions, what can we do? First, make sure you never dwell on any one question. Don't be afraid to guess. It doesn't feel good to guess. It's very stressful, but it's more important to finish on time than it is to spend that extra time to get one more question right. Because odds are, if it's something you're not too sure of, you're going to spend more time to maybe not even find the answer, where you might have a nice, easy question where you're going to know where to find it at the end that you'd be able to get to if you had just skipped this one. And don't forget, if you do have time left over, you can come back and try to find these answers that you had guessed on. I would recommend marking any of them where you guess with a star or some symbol, something. So that way, if you do have that extra time, you can come back, find those symbols, and know, okay, here's one that I guessed on. I can try and find the answer now. You can try implementing a skip rule, which goes along with this guessing. This is the first thing I would often try with my students, and it helps a lot once you get used to it. What I mean by this skip rule is for every passage, I would allow my students one skip. So the first question that they get to, that they have just no idea where to start, instead of trying like, okay, maybe I can find this, just be like, I don't know what this was. I'm immediately just going to guess. Don't waste any time on it. You can see if you can eliminate some of the questions or answer choices just logically speaking on what you just read, but you want to spend very little time. That'll save you a lot of time on a question you probably weren't going to get anyways. You can come back to these if you have to, but more likely you're going to want to come back to some others that you thought you'd be able to find, but you didn't quite have enough time. Go to those first. Now, when you do come back to these, if you can find some of the ones that are those specific details where it's just find it in the passage, those are the ones you want to come back to with your extra time, because you can just kind of skim, and if you're lucky, you will find your answer and you'll know you got it right. If it's an inference type of question, you're not necessarily going to find it. You might find some support to help you get there, but they can be harder. In some extreme cases, some of my students needed to utilize 2 skips per passage. Try to avoid that if at all possible, because that's guaranteeing you're going to probably miss a lot of questions. But even then, it's better off to go ahead and miss those so you can get to the questions you do know how to get the answer to. And in these cases, usually that would mean those students would end up finishing a little ahead of time, and then they'd start coming back to these. But that would just help with self-control, because these students were the ones that really had a hard time with the dwelling, where they'd get to that question, they wouldn't know how to find it, and they'd get stuck. They'd keep looking and looking and looking and wasting a lot of time. So I had to get them to just accept moving on, so that way they can get through the whole test. Another thing you can do, which is very tedious, but I had my students do it more often than you'd think, time every question individually. Like I said, a big theme here is going to be breaking it down into small pieces and timing each one. This, obviously, you can't do on the real one, but it will help you develop a mental clock so you can know, well, am I answering this question in a reasonable amount of time, or is this something where I'm taking too long? And so it's time to start guessing and moving on. So if your initial read is done in 4 minutes, that would give you about 30 seconds per question. So if you're doing this practice, you've already finished your read, you're to the question part, set your timer for 30 seconds, try and answer your first question. Or, even better, is to use a stopwatch. So instead of having an alarm go off at 30 seconds, you can have it count up. And as soon as you answer it, stop it. Or as soon as you get to the point where you decided, okay, this is taking too long, stop it. And then you can know, all right, that took me 27 seconds. Great, that's about the right time. Or let's say it's something you found your answer and then you look at the clock and it took you 58 seconds. Then you know, okay, I probably would have been better off eliminating some answer choices and guessing on that one. And that will give you an idea of where the 30 seconds is. The other thing you can do is actually setting the alarm for 30 seconds, kind of like with the read, setting the alarm for 4 minutes. So that way you can get a mental clock of, well, what is 30 seconds? And then when that goes off, you'll eventually get an idea of, okay, I'm getting close to 30 seconds because this is normally when the alarm goes off. And as you start getting more comfortable with what that 30 seconds is, then you can go back to doing all 10 questions at once. Now, do keep in mind, some questions you're going to get to faster than others. This doesn't mean you have to answer every single question in 30 seconds. Some will take a little longer, some will be faster, but this will give you a good idea of what your pacing is going to be and guide you on knowing when it's time to make that call to guess on that question and just move on to the next one to save time. So when we do look for the types of questions that take you the longest because you're doing this individually, you might find that there are inference type questions, that those are the ones you always take forever on because you can't find it in the passage because they're not in there. You just have to find support to give you an idea to read between the lines. If that's something you struggle with, that would probably be the best one to use for your skip rule. Skip the inference ones, at least the first one where you're really not sure where to go. You might find that it's the specific detail questions because you keep looking and trying to find it and you can't. That's very common because that's the downside of those detail questions, is if you don't know where it is, you can't answer it. So be really careful with those in particular, the specific details, because if you can find it, they can be really fast. But if you don't, it's really tempting to be like, oh darn, it wasn't there. Well, what if it's over here? Well, let me go read this paragraph. Well, surely if I've already read these, it's got to be over here. And then before you know it, you've reread the whole passage again and taken another 3 minutes on one question. Do not do that. You really have to get an idea of where that 30 seconds is so you can know, all right, I didn't know where it was, I've got to move on. My general rule of thumb for those detail questions, check the first 2 places where you think it's going to be. If it's not there, eliminate any completely illogical answers and then guess. That way you can save time and you can go on and still finish, and you can come back if you think you might know where it is after you've gotten through the rest of the reading section. So hopefully these all make sense. You obviously, for all of these strategies, don't need to do all of them. Try them all. I'd recommend in the order that I had outlined them. Some will work for some students, others will work for others. there might be other things you have to do. Maybe in your annotations, instead of just bracketing, maybe you have your own symbols that work. I've had some that use a star for emotion language, an exclamation mark for important punctuation. Maybe they'll write one word on the side if it's a proper noun that they think was really important. I got to be really careful with that because that can take some time, but for some people that works better. So experiment, pick something in particular to try, but for each one that you practice, and you can get there. Just be patient and keep working on it. Good luck, and I'll see you on the next ones.